Well, welcome everybody. It's been a couple of weeks since we last did this, so welcome back. Some people might have gotten out of the habit, but that's life. But I'm happy to be with you, and thank you for Kerry helping me as usual. Normally this is a Kerry and Leo week, but we did our Kerry and Leo week a couple of weeks ago, right? With the on service coordination. So for those of you that were with us, I hope you appreciated that session, and if you didn't, you can give us new ideas. We're always open to new ideas. So just really quickly, the numbers are down, like from 2 weeks ago. New COVID, I mean, still a lot of people, nearly 11,000 people got the virus. It's not going anywhere quickly. So the total of 538,000 people have gotten the virus in Massachusetts, a little higher than the number of deaths, as you all know, that just got recorded. The day across the United States, by the way. Let me just add that phrase. So there's been over 500,000 people who have caught the virus in Massachusetts. There was 346 deaths over the past week, which brings our total of deaths to 15,462 people. It's a little higher than the number a few weeks ago. And again, deaths will trail off, I hope, and not only hope, they will trail off. They'll get smaller and smaller as the number of people catching the virus goes down. And we're seeing still the negative fallout from so many people having the virus during the winter and the holiday season as well. And there was under 500,000 people in the past 7 days that were positive for the virus. I guess 500,000 week, because that brought it up to 27.8 million people who caught the virus in the United States of America. And of that, at the day I looked it up, it was 494,000 deaths. So that was on Saturday. And if you were watching TV or reading the Globe, it was 500,000 by this morning. So we've crossed, not a great threshold. The deaths were up about 15,000 from the last time we checked. But both rises are less than a few weeks ago in terms of the USA. Obviously, in Massachusetts, we had a little more deaths than we did a few weeks ago. And you know what's odd? As of February 17th, I just heard Rhode Island's doing much better. So I don't know, when I go on this national website and I see that the Dakotas, Rhode Island, Utah, and Arizona are still the highest per capita, if that might have changed by today, because we're hearing, a lot of positive things about Rhode Island. And just quickly, this is the Congregate Cure site, and the state schools are flat. As I said a couple of weeks ago, their numbers, though, in terms of recovery, are very high. So they did go through the virus in a big way earlier. And let me go to the next slide to share the numbers with you. The community, they went down over 2 weeks from 239 the last time we reported to 129. 204 catching the virus. Again, that's what we know, that's reported. And then this is both state operated and private nonprofit. Less than 5 deaths have been reported. And we really need to, I have to request the communal total this week, because I haven't requested that. I don't know if Hillary, you guys have requested that, but I haven't requested that in a month and a half, and I should, because there's no way to really tell from the way the charts report every week. And then the second surge, just as a matter of fact, it did have a significant impact. It may not have gone through entire homes because people were wearing masks better and gloves and all of that, versus the first surge where literally entire homes would have the virus, okay? There are exceptions to that. Some entire homes did happen to, but as a rule, anecdotally, and I have to say this anecdotally, I would hear about 1 and 2 people in a home and the rest not having it. And again, how much that had to do is clearly better practices in the homes, and also partially maybe people having more immunity to the virus. But clearly, we're not up to 100%, so clearly a lot of people don't have immunity in the congregate homes. So that's a recap. For those of you that came on, a few minutes ago, I just said I would be going through the COVID presentation pretty quickly today. At the end, if you want to ask questions, feel free of Hillary and Kerry. Our priorities continue to be what they are. We just over 1,400 people sent the emails in about broadening the vaccine prioritization, and then about a week ago, we sent in a letter, even going more broadly than our email. And we may end up, the staff's considering whether we should put up a new email action center, with that broad letter, where we're basically asking that all caregivers, all people with disabilities, adults, um, be prioritized, not just people in congregate settings. A lot of people are prioritized if you look at it in terms of the progress we've made. And I do think if we keep advocating, as the supply gets more, then I think we have a better chance of getting prioritized. As long as the supply is what it is, I think we're going to have a tougher time to push people. And of course, as you all know, 65-year-olds and above just got authorized. And that's probably what crashed the website the other day, right? Because so many people, I think that was 1 million more people. Am I making that up, or a combination of comorbid, conditions and these age? So it really threw things off big time. Okay, so that's the recap. And see, I don't know. So it's a relatively recent picture of Hillary Dunn Stanisz. I think I said your last name right. I never say it. So, we've known Hillary forever. We've known Disability Law Center, forever as well. And just to say, when I first started at the Arc of Massachusetts, it was 1991, 92. And we worked very closely with Disability Law Center and Center for Public Representation. Great working together. And I would say through the years, always had a good relationship. But then again, now it's back to great working together in the last several years with Hillary and Rick and Marlene and the team over there. And of course, Linda's been there forever almost throughout that whole period. She probably came in a few years later. It's a pleasure working with them, and just want to remind people, the Roland action included Disability Law Center and Center for Public Representation. That was for people who were stuck in nursing homes that were under 65. And of course, Nikki's Law, the work we did recently. But Hillary's been there on and off for, I won't say the number of years, but it's over a decade easily. If I'm making that up, that's okay. She's very experienced. She handles a whole range of issues. She is point for, I think, quality monitoring for the service system, because I don't want to take away from her presentation. I'm realizing I'm saying more than I should. She's a board member, very active board member of the Mass Sibling Support Network, and she's done that since 2013. She serves on our steering committee on policy and advocacy, which is a key priority setting group. Oh, by the way, since she serves on the board of MSSN, you might have guessed that she's a sibling of someone with an intellectual disability, and you would be right if you guessed that. And she's also a council member on the Massachusetts Developmental Disabilities Council. So she's pretty busy, but it's a pleasure to have you with us. And Hillary, you're going to be first doing an overview of DLC and then talking about CLAVIC, the CLAVIC initiative. And let me get out of there so people can see you, and stop sharing so they can see the gallery views. And we'll highlight you. So I want to talk to you about, you want to share a little bit about DLC first and what you guys have been doing?
Sure. You were right about having been at DLC for a decade, which is scary in some ways, how time flies. That's, yeah, a decade plus a couple years in private practice. So it's been a long go of it. It's really is amazing how time flies. But anyway, so I've been a lawyer at the Disability Law Center for a while. And I just wanted to first do a quick overview of kind of what DLC is in general, and the work that we do in general. For people, I know some people are probably very familiar with us, but some aren't. And then I'm going to talk about a specific grant that we have. But so first, DLC, broad overview. And Leo, feel free to chime in if I leave something out that you think is important or whatever. So we are just, in COVID times, we're mostly working remotely, but our main office is in Boston. And we have an office in Northampton, out in Western Mass as well. We serve people with disabilities, any type of disability across the entire state. So it's a pretty broad constituency to serve, and we have a pretty small staff and limited resources. So we do the best we can and work really hard. So we are an independent nonprofit. We're not state affiliated or federal government affiliated. Our services are free, which you would can imagine makes the demand for our services pretty high since they are free. We don't have income guidelines. So like some traditional legal services, you have to be below certain income guidelines. We don't have those. Of course, if there are two kind of equally meritorious cases and somebody's family has an income of $900,000 and somebody's family has an income, or they themselves have an income of, it's only SSI, so it's under, about 10 grand a year or something, then we're gonna help the person that has the, lesser means available to them. But overall income is not an issue for us one way or another. So the Disability Law Center, we wear a couple different hats, I guess is a good way to say it. In some ways, we're a traditional kind of legal services type of organization. And in that way, I mean, we represent people with disabilities who have maybe housing discrimination cases or employment discrimination or public accommodations type of cases. So, like service animals, those types of public accommodation types of cases. Most of that work is individual representation. So it is a little bit more, like I said, traditional legal services work. We also do quite a bit of legislative and policy advocacy. Leo mentioned our working with the ARC and many other constituents for Nikki's Law, the DPPC abuse registry. That was obviously a big one, but we do a lot of policy advocacy at the administrative levels. So whether that's with EOHHS or DDS directly or DMH directly, for example, we do a lot of work in those areas as well. So that's kind of one hat that we wear. Now, another hat that we wear is we are the state's protection and advocacy system for Massachusetts. So every state has to have a version of us, has to have a protection and advocacy agency. And I'm just going to say P&A because it's a lot easier and shorter. So what that means is every state has to have one. So it's a federal mandate. And along with the federal mandate does come federal funding to do that work. But again, we're still an independent nonprofit. It's just the funding comes through grants from the federal government to do the work. And that work is focused on abuse and neglect of people with disabilities. Our definitions of abuse and neglect are quite a bit broader and more expansive than, for example, the Disabled Persons Protection Commission. Their definitions of abuse and neglect are pretty narrow in scope. We have nothing to do with them in that sense, so our definitions are quite a bit broader. So I encourage you to, when you think about abuse or neglect for work that we might do, to think about it in a pretty broad manner of what it could encapsulate. So for our abuse and neglect work, of course, we can still do individual representation, policy and legislative advocacy work, but what we really have focused on over the last chunk of years is the kind of unique authority that comes with being the protection and advocacy agency, and that is we have monitoring and investigation authority. So I'll take monitoring first. So for monitoring, we can go on site anywhere that a person with disabilities receives services. So that could be on the kind of IDDD side, that certainly could be a day program, a supported work program. I mean, we're not going to go to somebody's independent job that they're working at on their own capacity because they're not receiving services there. If you think about it in that way, it has to be where they're receiving services. Could be group homes. It could be the large institutions, Rentham or Hogan. But for other disabilities, it could be inpatient psychiatric units, nursing homes, jails. Those are the ones coming to the top of my head. And special ed residential schools, special ed day schools, even public schools we've monitored because obviously lots of kids with disabilities are served in our public schools, and that doesn't mean that things don't happen in the public schools in addition to some of the private special ed schools. So that's an example of some examples of where we monitor. And when we monitor, we can talk to the people, any person with a disability that wants to talk to us or communicate with us in any way. Of course, it's their choice whether they want to talk to us or not, but we have full access to talk to them in a private setting. So, you know, the staff or anybody can't be around, but certainly there are times that perhaps a person with a disability has a trusted staff person that they want around, and that's okay too. It's their choice. So we go there to kind of monitor what's going on. We have specific questions that we ask, specific things that we're looking for. We talk to staff as well. So that's monitoring. And why don't I just pause to see if anybody, do you want me to see if people have questions now, or would you rather me wait till the end?
I think, no, I think this is a great description. I think I'm so glad you're doing this, because honestly, historically, you know, people don't get this full overview. I mean, like the ARC too, you have the part of a national connection through the National Disability Rights Network as well. But go on with the second.
Okay.
And by the way, you guys early in COVID, you asked for some reports, didn't you? When you saw a few deaths in one setting, right? And people got nervous, right? Because it was sort of like everybody was so overwhelmed during COVID that, and we helped calm people down and say, look, it's their function. This is not unusual at all. And you know, and yeah, it might be a heightened sense of anxiety, but this is serious stuff, and they need to get in there, you know, as the PNA, you know. Go ahead.
So, yeah, I mean, for monitoring, COVID has obviously presented a challenge in some ways, right? Because we're not going to go unless it's absolute emergency, exigent type of circumstances, which has happened for a couple of my colleagues. We're not going to go on site right now. That's, you know, not the safest choice for anybody at this point in time. But like I said, there have been some circumstances where people have. So our monitoring has been done remotely. So that's a lot more paperwork type of monitoring, a lot more like Zoom one-on-one type of sessions for people that are able to participate. And also, you know, we've even asked, you know, the provider to kind of basically take an iPad or whatever and kind of, you know, walk around the residence, walk around the facility, things like that. Is it ideal? No. Is it, you know, trying to do the best we can to make it work? Yes. But I think, you know, as people are vaccinated more and more, obviously we are anxious to get back out on site, because that, you know, you really need to be on site to be doing I think like the best possible job that we can be doing. Just as info, I mean, because we're not state employees, we're a private nonprofit. So it's not as though we're like prioritized to be vaccinated. I know some front facing like DDS folks are prioritized to be vaccinated so that they can be on site. So, you know, we'll see how it goes, but hopefully we'll be able to be on site more soon. And if there's providers on the call or on this Zoom, why we monitor places, like how they're chosen, it's not random. It is always data informed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody reported some horrible thing, so that's why we're there. It could be somebody called with something that was like kind of concerning, and we just want to learn a little bit more about it. So I don't know, I think sometimes providers get it, and it's just, this is part of our job. It's part of what we have to do. We're mandated to do it. And I think sometimes providers that aren't used to it, it's, oh my God, what are they doing here? Why are they here? This is just a headache and all of that. So, you know, it's part of what we have to do.
Before you talk about that
Yeah.
program, I want to mention just the whole other thing in terms of
Sure.
how many cases you can take on realistically. You know, like someone like you would take very few, if any, you know, because you're so busy overseeing the system. And you're the only person, I'm pretty sure, right, that tends to do that role in terms of DDS. I know your organization has a DMH responsibility too, if I remember right. And then, but the other piece of that is that when you do take cases, people at DLC, you try to take them on that have systemic implications, right? It's not, so people, I tend not to refer, right? I mean, we have trouble finding lawyers for people anyway, in general, but I wouldn't think of calling DLC about just a case that doesn't have systemic implication, right? Because you have so little time to take on cases.
Yeah, so when I talk about I'll wind up my spiel about just DLC in general shortly. And when we talk about the specific grant, I'll talk a little bit more about how it gives us more capacity to do individual representation cases, which is great. So Leo touched on a really important issue, that we are a small staff with limited resources and a very broad mandate. So that leaves us every year with the very difficult choice of trying to balance individual representation with systemic impact. And for the last chunk of years, we have definitely kind of looked at it through the lens of systemic work impacts a larger number of people, so that we have focused more on systemic versus kind of the individual cases that come in that are very important to that individual person and that individual family. But we feel like we can make more impact because maybe we've seen that case or iterations of that case, 20 times that year. So why don't we try to do a systemic fix of it instead of doing those 20 individual cases over and over? It's kind of the lens that we've looked through. People can have a very healthy debate about what's the best way to approach that, but that's how we have done it. So there are individual cases that we do handle. Our website has our priorities that are change every year. So that spells it out a little bit. But we do focus a lot more on systemic work. So that could be impact litigation, like one case that we think will impact lots of others. It could be looking at more class action work. We've done some of that, particularly in some prison cases, looked at more class action type of things for people with severe mental illness in prison situations. And our protection advocacy work, the monitoring and investigations, is more of a broad systemic work as opposed to individual representation. So that leads into just quickly the investigation authority that we have. They are resource intensive. So again, we look at, is this a situation? I mean, anybody who's abused or neglected, it's awful, it's horrible. The things that come into our office are upsetting, to say the least, that we see every day, and it's discouraging. However, we have to look at it from the stance of which ones can we pick and invest our resources into that will impact the broadest number of people, is how we try to look at it. And that still may be a really bad instance of abuse for one person that happened in one person, but it's a big provider and we've anecdotally heard issues about other things, or something of that nature. So when we investigate, we can get access to records that a traditional lawyer would not be able to get access to, lots of confidential information. A catch there is that we can't necessarily publicly release all that information. So for example, Leo referenced deaths, the COVID deaths, or just DDS, talk about deaths of folks receiving DDS services in general. Under our protection and advocacy agency hat, we receive copies of all the death reports. So I know every person that has died of COVID. I see all of the death reports, but it is under our protection our P&A hat. So I can't sit here and tell you all the people who have died of COVID. I could give you a broad number, but Leo has given you that information as well. And what we do with that information is look at those and try to determine, are there ones that seem problematic? If so, we follow up and get more information. Are there ones where there's just not enough information for us to know whether something bad happened or not? And we follow up and get lots of information from DDS and the state on those. So just some information about deaths and our role in death monitoring and investigation. So that's my overview of DLC. So if people have some questions, then I'll jump into the specific grant work that we're starting on.
There's a couple of things that
Okay.
I think there's a question. Boy, this is like a classic question, which is, and that happened to someone I know too, where somebody called Lucy about a woman in a vendor residence who was hospitalized with bruises and bed sores and pneumonia. And DDS wants her temporarily to go back to the same house. Now, the father does not want that to happen for obvious reasons. Is there a way to avoid that? Can there be what's an option there? Because he really doesn't want her to go back to that place given the situation.
Yeah, that's a complicated
You might need more
situation.
information, right?
Yeah. So, Lucy, perhaps you could either reach out to me offline,
Follow
or
up offline. Yeah.
yeah, or the father, I think you said, yeah, can certainly call DLC to do an intake. You know, the hospital keeper until a safe, must the hospital keeper until a safe place to live is provided? Well, I mean, that's a complicated question, just because, like, what's the definition of safe place, right? So the hospital may view it as it's safe to go back to that residence temporarily, in the same way that DDS is viewing that as safe. So that's a little
I mean,
tricky.
that's the hitch, because DDS is viewing it safe. I would say, from my non-legal hat, if he really feels strongly that way, say no way, and play it out. Play it out with the regional director, go up the food chain, and then call Hillary offline for more advice. But I know this happened to someone who's active with us for decades, and we had lost touch, and she called, her son had been abused in a home. Doesn't, happen to be state op, but he had been, it can happen anywhere. And
Yep.
so she really didn't want him to go back, but he went back. And then suddenly I saw in the news, report that two guys had been arraigned. So I'm like psyched. Oh, great. They got that call. She goes, oh my God, Leo, no, that's yet another incident in the same place. And I said, wow, now that's systemic, right? Two more staff that were accused, and you guys know the case too, Hillary. And it was something, it was blew me away. And that's a great example, by the way, of systemic. Like, when you're looking at something in a program, there's a cultural issue there. And I don't mean cultural as in race or what ethnicity. I mean cultural in terms of supervision, the quality of the supervision. And those were the people that were busted, that actually, because it was a video cam without sound there, they were able to see them do it. So I think he's got to go with his gut, and then, but please get her offline, because it is complicated, and the facts are going to make a difference on that
Yeah.
situation. And then Linda asked a question about, give an example about something positive that's happened because of your monitoring role. And I can say one example. I'll give a quick one. Was in Nikki's law. You not only helped, though, drafting around the language, but you had data that you had collected. You and the team there. That was helpful for us when Maura and I were working with you, understanding some of the things, like, in fact, the lower ratio of cases, right, that were deemed to be abuse related. Like, that was a concern. We've never gone back to that. That's an area we want to revisit one day, right? Of how many basically are sort of made clean, I guess, or said, no, there's not enough justification, to say whether it's significant or not. But by having that data, we were able to get a bill passed that I think might not have gotten passed. So that's one example
Yeah.
for me about your role.
Yeah. And Lucy, just quickly, for your example, when I talk about the grant that we're getting, I
Oh,
can kind of incorporate it a little bit, so I'll answer a little bit more then.
Great, thank you.
in
Sure.
fact, you know what? Why don't you talk about the program? Because now I feel like
Oh,
it's crossing over into that,
okay.
now that you said that.
Well, I did so I guess just two quick things, though, for Linda's question about, like, some positive things that have come from monitoring role. I'll do that quickly, and then we'll talk about the grant. So just what we focused on during COVID time for monitoring has been a lot of COVID related types of monitoring. So in terms of, we've been able to get targeted data. It was more not that useful is not the right word, but towards the beginning of the pandemic, I think it was quite a bit more informative about places that were having whole houses break out, with positives. I had to deal with a house where there was 8 people in the house and all were positive. And that type of monitoring is really focused on policies, protocols, and getting the provider agency to answer some questions, and then talk about some remedial steps that might be able to alleviate some problems in the future, such as maybe doing some things a little bit differently for people who share rooms, who have a roommate, than what happened in that situation. So I think we've been able to do a lot of positive COVID related monitoring during this time. So that's been positive. And well, I'll leave that there and talk about our grant work for now. And then, I'm happy to stay and answer any questions about general DLC work or this grant work. So switching to the grant work, CLAVIC, it stands for Civil Legal Assistance for Victims of Crime. It is supported by the Massachusetts Office for Victims Assistance. MOVA is kind of where the grant comes through, and I think it's actually a federal Department of Justice type of money for victims of crime that comes into MOVA and then becomes part of this Civil Legal Assistance for Victims of Crime grant. Now, several legal services agencies in the state have the same grant, but we have it and we're the one that focuses on people with disabilities. So our version of how we use the grant is very disability focused, where another legal services agency might use it or is using it in ways that is not disability focused. So what this is for DLC purposes, the victim of the crime has to be a person with a disability. Crime is very, think about that pretty broadly, because the crime, it does need to be in a reasonable way a crime, but it does not have to be reported to the police or, have resulted in a arrest or conviction. So it can be something that happened that you never even reported to the police, but it does need to reasonably be construed as a crime. So we have a pretty broad definition of what victim of crime would be. Now, the crime and the legal issues coming from that do have to be related to your disability. There has to be kind of some nexus pulling all that together. And just to be clear, this isn't to replace the police or even the Disabled Persons Protection Commission. So if somebody is a victim of a crime, there is a whole criminal element to that, right? That if they do report it to the police and if it's investigated, arrested, charged, whatever, that's the separate part. This is the civil legal aid part. So the legal issues that may arise from it that are not criminally related and wouldn't be addressed through the criminal justice system. So I know this is very amorphous sounding, and I will get to specific concrete examples to try to nail it down a little bit more so we can understand it. But just a couple other facts about this grant is the crime can be past or present, meaning it could be something that happened to you or your loved one in the past that is still impacting them today for some reason. Or it could be that the crime, just happened and there are certain issues related to that crime that, you need help with now. So that's what I mean by past or present. And these cases would all be individual representation cases. That's what we have to use the money for, is to represent people on an individual basis. So it does provide us a larger capacity to do more individual representation cases, which is a huge positive for us and hopefully the community. So I want to give some kind of general categories and some examples to maybe make this a little bit more clear for people about what exactly civil legal assistance for victims of crime could be. So for example, somebody could be a victim of a crime and the crime itself left the person disabled, right? The crime caused some type of disability. So that could be somebody was abused or attacked in some way and it resulted in physical injuries, traumatic brain injury, or PTSD or extreme trauma, things like that, right? A kid growing up in a house where there's child abuse, domestic violence, things like that, may have significant resulting trauma from that. And that trauma, those emotional disabilities, may require certain services that a school district is not providing to them. So that could be an example of how it could play out in a special ed situation. Or if something happens and it results in a traumatic brain injury, now that person needs help accessing the state's brain injury services or something of that nature, right? So something happened, you were a victim of a crime that caused you to become disabled or your loved one to have a disability, and you now need certain services or accommodations related to that. And maybe that they're new services, or maybe it's an expanded array of services. So for example, somebody served by DDS, is already served by DDS, and unfortunately they say they were sexually assaulted. that sexual assault has a whole criminal element to it, but it also could result in that person being quite a bit traumatized and from what happened to them. And it might be that, you know, they were already receiving services to go to a day program or supported employment and some support residentially, but now there is this trauma aspect that may need different or additional services or supports, and the person may need help advocating for and accessing those supports. So I hope those are some examples that portray kind of when a crime has left you disabled or left, you know, caused a disability, so to speak. So a second group could be, excuse me, your disability or your loved one's disability kind of made you vulnerable to be a target of a crime. And some examples there could be thinking about like financial exploitation. So if somebody financially exploited you or, you know, your loved one, and it could be fraud or theft, something that could reasonably be that a crime of fraud or theft, whether it's a crime that's reported or not, again, doesn't matter. But there could be civil legal issues related to that financial exploitation that the Disability Law Center would be able to assist with. So that might be another type of case that you would call our intake line to try to get our assistance for that. It also could be, unfortunately, we hear a lot where somebody has a representative payee and the representative payee is misusing the person's funds for themselves or some other, you know, inappropriate manner. So whether that is a crime or not, I don't really care. If there's a rep payee that is misusing your or your loved one's funds, please call the DLC about that, because we have like a whole category, so to speak, of work that we have to do around representative payees misusing people's funds. So just kind of generally, financial exploitation, think of that broadly, gave you a couple of specifics, but those are some cases that we might be able to assist with. Another example of kind of this category where maybe your disability or your loved one's disability has made you or your loved one more vulnerable to be the target of the crime. So you could think about, and this could be in a special ed residential school, or this could be the adult side in a day program, group home, whatever. If you're physically abused by a caretaker, and there might be criminal aspects to that, if it's possible that it's criminally prosecuted because the physical abuse rose to that level. There could be ramifications through the Disabled Persons Protection Commission, but there also could be other issues that we could assist with. So what might that be? So for example, Lucy, the case, your situation that you're dealing with, I don't know all the details of it, but let's just take that and say that, or that situation or another similar situation, that there was some physical abuse that, you know, we can reasonably say there was physical abuse and that we're going to look at that as a crime. Then you start looking at, okay, there's the criminal aspects of that, there's the DPPC aspects, but then there's the aspect that comes up a lot, which is the person, even if the abuser is fired, the person with disability or their family may still want a change in placement. It's too traumatic for the person to stay there, or, you know, whatever the situation. From a legal standpoint, right, that's basically just a change in placement case. And we can now take those as individual representation if, you know, with the giant qualifier of if the person is a victim of a crime, as I've tried to explain. We're trying to look at that as broadly as we can, but it does need to be something that could arguably constitute a crime. So that's another example of what types of cases we might be able to take. And then the last one, and then I swear I'll stop talking, is your disability or your loved one's disability makes it difficult to get legal help or access the court system. So what I mean by this is perhaps what's going on with you or your loved one, then you need to file a restraining order or a harassment order, or just generally you have to appear in court, but your disability makes it very difficult for you to communicate or talk with court staff or the judge, or maybe file the paperwork that's necessary. So we actually had a case come in fairly recently of a gentleman with a progressive, neurodegenerative type of issue, and it was progressed along quite a bit. So while he was able to communicate through technology types of stuff to get his points across, he needed assistance filing a harassment order or a petition for a harassment order, because his in-home, the people that were providing in-home assistance were stealing from him and financially exploiting him and things like that. But because of his disabilities, it was very, very difficult for him to be able to file the harassment order, to seek that protection from the court. And that's something that we were able, I think it's ongoing, I don't know, that we are able to assist with, is if somebody needs the assistance because their disability makes it very difficult for them to access the civil legal help that they need to be able to get. So I'll stop there. Those are a bunch of different examples. I hope that they helped make it a little clear that what civil legal assistance for victims of crime could be. So Carrie, if you have anything to chime in with, or we can start going
just
through.
just another thought. I know that sometimes because of people's disabilities, they're vulnerable to get, seduced into doing things that may not be, that aren't legal. And I'm just wondering if that would be something that DLC, this special grant. I mean, it gets tricky, but when a person with a disability commits a crime, and whether or not they were cognizant of that it was illegal and that sort of thing.
I think so. That is tricky. That's going to be one that really depends on the circumstances and context. We've had one. I know that the major focus was not on, well, let's just say the individual with disability. His past did include being kind of duped into committing some fraudulent type of crimes that would be like fraud. That wasn't a barrier for our assisting him, but I will say we weren't assisting him with that. We were assisting him with the fact that his childhood was filled with being a victim of a lot of abuse and other types of crime, that there was a significant amount of trauma related to that. And he, because of his disability and his trauma, needed certain services from the state that he was having difficulty accessing. So it wasn't a barrier for us to assist him with that, but we were not helping him with like fighting that. At the end of the day, he needs a criminal defense attorney for that. But that is going to be a little depending on circumstances.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you. That's
Anyways, another not category, but example that's unfortunately happening more and more is, the internet and accessing the internet and social media and all of that is important. Hey, we all do it. People with disabilities should be able to do it too. With that said, there's a lot of not great people out there lurking on the internet that are, trying to run a scam of getting you to send them money, or, those types of things like cyber crimes. So we have had a couple come into the office where it's been a person with an intellectual disability who really has been kind of exploited in that way through an internet scam, and even some issues around, I guess blackmail, you would just say, like they were kind of duped into sending pictures that we wouldn't want shown. And, so there's obvious criminal elements to that, but there are aspects around helping them navigate through the system and seeing what other remedies outside of the criminal justice system are available to them that we can assist with.
That sounds like a great program. So is it on your website? Do you have a whole write-up about what kind of circumstances are that would be under this special grant, or?
So we do,
I want to distribute this everywhere.
So what might make the most sense, because I'm sure there's something on our website, but I don't know if it's exactly as detailed as what's in the flyer that we have for the program. So perhaps, Carrie, when you send out the slides afterwards, I
Yeah.
can make sure that you have the flyer that, so everybody can get that, and then,
Great.
you know, share it in your networks widely would be great. So yeah, that is probably the
That's
best way to
awesome.
go. Yeah.
So as you were talking, 3 people popped into my head.
Okay.
You know, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is great. How about anyone had any questions? The chat is. Yes, so Linda's excited about sharing this information. I think, you know, unfortunately, this probably happens more than we think. And, you know, not having answers, sometimes you just kind of go through what you know, just the regular bucket. And when that bucket isn't big enough, it's, you know, this can make lasting impact. So
Yeah. So I entered into the chat just the general phone number for the Disability Law Center and the general email address, so
Great.
that if somebody wants to reach out to start the intake process, because we do have an intake process so somebody goes and talks to an intake specialist as a first step of kind of asking for legal assistance. Okay, so Diane asked, what will the capacity be for new cases? How many on average per year? Diane, I don't think we have that specific of information. We have, the grant is reasonably large in terms of the amount of funding it provides. But as with, which is great, right? We always need more funding and more resources, but it doesn't necessarily come with a lot of extra bodies, so that it's always this balance between what capacity we actually have as lawyers to continue to take on new cases. But right now, at this point, we have quite a bit of capacity to be taking on new cases that would fall under this CLAVIC grant. So I would encourage anybody to call. You know, maybe 6 months from now, we will be having a different conversation. But right now, we definitely have capacity to take on these individual representation cases. So I'd encourage anybody to call. Trying to think, does anybody else have questions? You know, for this population, I think there's a lot, it's unfortunate, but there is a lot of abuse and neglect, or, you know, significant human rights violations, those types of things that happen in the IDDD world. You know, and it's not great to always focus on the negative things happening versus some of the positive things happening out there, but it's the nature of our work is looking at the negatives. And there is a lot of abuse and neglect out there. And when stuff happens, you might report it to the police. It may or may not, you know, result in any criminal action. You're going to report it to DPPC, the Disabled Persons Protection Commission. Now, that may or may not result in something that you, as a person with a disability, or you as having a loved one with a disability, it may or may not result in a way that you are satisfied with. And that could be that, you know, the abuse was unsubstantiated, right? They didn't make a finding of abuse and saying there wasn't enough evidence, or there wasn't evidence of actual injury, right? And that can be really difficult. I want you to keep in mind that for our purposes, like, that doesn't matter. So the fact that DPPC did not substantiate what happened, and you are still dissatisfied with how that played out and what is happening for you or your loved one in terms of any remedies to come from the abuse or neglect that happened, you could still call us, because that would, if it was physical, you know, if we're talking about abuse here or neglect, that could still constitute a crime. And there can be individual advocacy and individual representation that we could do for you to try to, you know, remediate the situation somewhat. The result from DPPC is not the be-all end-all of legal advocacy. I guess I would just encourage you to think broadly about those are also circumstances where we might be able to represent somebody under this CLAVIC grant.
Yeah, it's a great way of thinking, you know, of just kind of looking and problem solving and that sort of thing. So did you see Lucy's chat about if a school doesn't provide FAPE, is that a crime?
I mean, if there is a crime under the Massachusetts Penal Code that you could point me to, then I would say I'd love to be able to include those in thinking about the categories of cases we could take under this grant. But I'm not aware of FAPE, not providing appropriate services being considered a crime. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure that's going to work. However, if it's a situation where a child was a victim of a crime and that crime either caused their disability, so now they need to access special education services because the crime caused their disability, or they already were on an IEP, but they now essentially have more disabilities because the crime, trauma is the one that comes to mind because of either child abuse or domestic violence in the home or bullying. But when I say bullying, I mean severe, persistent bullying that could constitute a crime, meaning like criminal harassment, not just, not to minimize what can happen out there, but I mean severe, persistent bullying that could arguably constitute a crime. Those types of situations may result in a child needing additional services, right? So then that could be something that we could assist with. Now Lucy asked, what about abuse and neglect by school? Yes, so, just whether somebody is an adult or a child, if there is abuse or neglect in a school setting, so it could be, at a residential school, of course, at a private special ed school, or it could be in a public school. So let's talk about a public school setting where a child is receiving services in a public school. There's still restraint and seclusion that occurs in public schools. Now, if it is a restraint, if a child was restrained or secluded in a really inappropriate way, because unfortunately some restraints that are done by the book, they're not illegal, so to speak, right? But if there was excessive inappropriate restraints, for example, that might be something that we could look at to see if that could fall under, physical abuse or physical assault, in the way that we could look at that as a possible crime and see if we could do that case under this grant. So I know I'm providing like a lot of explanation with each answer because every case is going to be different and require this individual assessment of, is it a person with a disability? What was the crime? Are they a victim of that crime? What legal assistance are they looking for? And is the legal assistance related to their status as a crime victim, sort of? So we do kind of have to do this full analysis of every one of these situations to see if we'd be able to assist.
Great, thanks, Hillary. I also, think it's a great way of helping the people by looking at wraparound supports and services and just not, focusing on the crime, which is awesome.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and that can make some lasting change.
Right. So we were just talking about it in the context of like special ed or FAPE services, but there's also, thinking about it in the wraparound, there's a lot of, whether it's through DDS, TMH, or through, CBHI, there's a lot of services that can be really difficult to navigate for someone if they've just, for a parent whose child has just gone through some, they're a victim of a crime. Maybe they were just, there was a lot of child abuse in the home and there's domestic violence in the home, and that parent is dealing with the court system on that front. There's things going on with the kid that, this is going beyond the scope of some of the work that DLC maybe has traditionally done, but because we try to not so much do systems navigation versus legal representation, right? Because they can be kind of different. You don't necessarily need a lawyer for systems navigation. Sometimes you do. But here, I think we're looking at this a little more broadly because just because of the circumstances that the person or the family may be in, that some aspect of systems navigation is certainly something that we would be a little more open to doing than maybe in some other situations. I hope that makes sense.
Carrie
Yeah,
and
no,
Hillary,
totally.
can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So this is Linda Cox.
Hi.
Hillary, so glad to hear a little bit more about what your bandwidth is, because I did not know. And with this grant, I work for the DESE program, and there's a lot going on in that program, not just in COVID, just the dimension of what the program is. And it's really wonderful to have this new information on this grant, because I know there's a number of individuals who come under some sort of systemic protection. They may have been out of shelters or, in different situations, and the system they've slipped through the cracks with COVID. They really have. And I find it heartwarming that there is something else that I can point them to, because after a while, you get lost. And I think this is going to pick up some pieces that were lost. The other piece, which is completely different, is I'm part of a CAB, like I'm sure many are on this call. And, we're starting to say, okay, it's been long enough with COVID that we haven't been able to go out and monitor, but we can do virtual monitoring. But it's tricky, right? But I think we're not watchdogs from a situation where we're looking for problems, but we can find problems. And having the right virtual template of how to go about this would be really a good instrument to have. And we're all trying to figure that out right now. So I'm not sure what I'm mentioning that for, except you have such a good mindset over, well, you might want to ask this, or you might want to ask that. So I just find that piece is, the CAB has a place in watchdogging. And I'm not sure how we can learn more, but we're at that place. And I'm sure Carrie and Leo would say, that is a place that we've got to spawn into. We may have a lot of shutdowns in the future, that we find ourselves right back to where we are. And it shouldn't go without being able to see what's happening inside.
Yeah, part of why we felt it was particularly important to continue actively monitoring kind of whatever that meant and whatever shape it took during COVID was, like a lot of people with disabilities and family members, we're really concerned about the lack of eyes on residents, for example, right? It's a really not formal way to say it, but oftentimes the more eyes on a place, the better that is, right? To be able to be checking on somebody. And while we understood for a while why folks from DDS were not, service coordinators were not going on site and things like that during the peak of the pandemic, we just were getting very concerned, because the only, they're in a group home. There's obviously the people living there, the staff working there, and then some amount of people from that provider agency that might be on site a little bit. But other than that, there have been times where there's been no visitation. The service coordinators are not on site. DDS and DPPC investigators were not doing anything on site unless in the most absolute extreme circumstances. So, we were and frankly still continue to be a little concerned about the lack of oversight and kind of removal of having more eyes on a place. So I think we're glad to hear that, some CABs are really getting going on this more. That's excellent. And I see that Diane entered that Victor Hernandez from DDS had sent out a template done by a CAB in the South Coastal Area office that I think had some COVID and health related questions. So
yeah,
that might be good.
I'm glad to have that. Yeah.
So while
it has questions that, based on experience of members, relate to, are you weighing people? Have they lost a lot of weight? Because that has been an issue with weight loss, or weight gain, but weight loss and bed sores, and questions related to, have they been able to contact their family? Are they able to participate in their programs, et cetera, et cetera. Everything you kind of want to see, you might want to rephrase it. But Linda, I can send that to you if you were not on the distribution list.
I was, and I like that. I like the whole mindset of that, Diane. I just think we
You wanna
need
send
to
it to
have an
me.
instrument.
Yeah, I mean, Diane, if you want to send it to me, I can send it out when I send
You
out.
know,
the report.
let me just ask permission of the cab folks and I'll
Sure.
pass it
Yeah.
along.
Okay,
Linda-
so I'm looking at the time.
Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Hillary.
Can I add just two other quick things, Linda? I don't want to waste time trying to find the link right now, but I can send it to Carrie for when she emails out the group. So the Disability Law Center, we do have like a survey on our website for people who either live in community residences or group homes, or, you know, family members or loved ones, you know, of someone who does, that you can fill out information in that. And that is another kind of data source for us to just try to keep like some picture of what's happening on the ground in different places and what's concerning, to help direct our monitoring and systemic type of advocacy. So that's what I want to say, number one. Number two is any kind of collaboration of DLC with cabs, for example. I'm not saying that like we're not open, or I don't want to say no to that. I don't know what it could look like and how it could help. I do just want to flag that, you know, the cabs are through DDS area offices, and I'm not sure that, and this isn't a, you know, jab at DDS, it's just a reality that they're a state agency. We have a separate and distinct function from that. And I'm not so sure how excited they would be to kind of have working together on that. So I would think that there would have to be some discussions with DDS about how we could work together on that. I hope that makes sense. And it's not meant as a swipe at DDS. It's just a reality of like a state agency and DLC do have different functions.
Agree.
All right then. Okay. Well, thank you, Hillary. This was a wonderful presentation. And it's really exciting to hear about the new program. We'll send folks out that flyer, and I hope everybody has a great day.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.